You are now full screen, and Hadley Heath Manning, everyone. I think let's do a round of applause because she suffered through this setup.
Oh, that's no problem. I do a lot of presentations on Skype, so I'm used to this.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Ralph and Kate, for having me, and thank you to all of you who have joined us today to talk about the male-female wage gap and some ideas about whether or not this gap presents a problem or what kind of problem, and if so, what kind of solutions are available to us. And I've put together some slides, and I'm going to try to share my screen with you, so you'll have to let me know if this is successful.
Go. Say go, Ralph.
Go!
All right. Give me a minute. I have to share my screen first and then start the slideshow. If I start the slideshow first, then I can't share my screen. So let me tell you a little bit about the organization I work for. I work for the Independent Women's Forum, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit research and education organization, or think tank. We're based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to increase the number of women who value free markets and personal liberty. And the wage gap is a very important issue for us. So I think I'm sharing my screen with you now. Is that right?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. So this is the popular representation of the wage gap. Everyone knows that there's a difference between what men earn and what women earn in our economy. That is a statistic that's compiled usually by the Department of Labor or the Current Population Survey or the Bureau of Labor Statistics or any number of government agencies keep track of the differential between men's and women's wages. But the way it's presented in popular culture is that this is a metric for equal work, that women are out doing the same jobs as men, and because of discrimination, we are being punished for being women, and we're bringing home smaller paychecks. That's the way it's represented. I just Googled wage gap, and these were some of the images that came up. Women are like men, but only cheaper. Does the wage gap mean that women get to leave work 23% early today? Tell Congress that equal work deserves equal pay. And wouldn't we like some extra money for our gasoline and groceries because women are paid less than men? Now, this representation isn't exactly accurate because the wage gap is not a measure of equal pay for equal work. It is a raw statistic. It compares the wages of all full-time working men and all full-time working women in our economy. Today it stands at 83 cents on the dollar. You may have heard 70 cents or 77 or 78. It changes every year, and it depends also on how it's measured, if it's measured over the course of a year or weekly wages. But typically, the Department of Labor takes all men and all women who work more than 35 hours per week, and they call that full-time workers, and then they make the comparison. Importantly, the statistic is not corrected for several variables or factors that we would expect to affect pay for both women and men. One of the biggest ones is choice of occupation. Men and women congregate in different professions, although many professions are open to women now that were not in generations past. Women continue to choose jobs that have better, more comfortable working conditions, that are part of social services like education or childcare and nursing. And men, on the other hand, tend to choose occupations that are higher paying and that typically come with less comfortable working conditions, night shifts, dangerous working conditions, unpleasant working conditions, and men often choose jobs that require more hours per week or are more demanding jobs. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Education is a difference, but if you pay attention to education statistics, you know that today more women are graduating from college than men. More women are earning bachelor's, master's, and PhDs than men. But this isn't reflected in the wages in our overall economy for two reasons. Number one, because this is only recently true. If you look at the generation of men who are maximizing their earnings today, they graduated college 30 years ago, and many of them were in the majority of college graduates at that time. So women are being educated at unprecedented levels in the United States, but still doesn't equal equilibrium in the workforce because of the catching up that women are doing. Experience is a big one. experience often is very different between men and women because women who are in their mid-20s and mid-30s are taking time out of the workforce more often than men to spend time with their families, to care for aging relatives, and so forth. And of course, this puts a dent in their work experience. Hours worked, that's another big one. So women who are working, and even women who are working full-time, often choose jobs where they don't have to spend as much time at the office. So if you compare the number of hours per day that women and men work, you'll see that on average, men work about at half an hour longer each day than women. And again, that's just a comparison between all men and women in the economy who are working full-time. That doesn't mean to imply that men work harder than women, or that if you're a woman, you're not working very hard. Often women are doing unpaid work in the home, and that's not accounted for in the wage gap. And then finally, other benefits are not taken into account when we compare men and women's wages. So we're not comparing health insurance benefits or retirement benefits or flexibility and some of what I like to call intangible work benefits. So right now, I mentioned I'm working from my home office. I have enormous flexibility in my job. I work for an organization that's based in Washington, and yet I live in Denver. So I'm taking advantage of workplace flexibility. I'm telecommuting, and I can trade a higher salary for these benefits, and that's a choice that I've made. Women more often seek those benefits because it meets their needs and it meets the needs of their family. Here's sort of an academic study that speaks to many of these variables. This is from the year 2000. Economist June O'Neill is just the expert of experts when it comes to the wage gap. So she put together basically a number of factors, and she wanted to figure out which of these factors explained how many cents on the dollar of the wage gap. So here she says experience on the job would explain about 9 cents of the wage gap. Professional choice, about 5.3 cents. Time out of the workforce, about 2.3 cents. And then there's about 3.3 cents on the dollar that she says remains unexplained. So all of this is to say that although the wage gap statistic in its raw form is not a good metric for discrimination, and it doesn't compare equal pay for equal work, that does not mean that once we correct for a variety of workplace factors and career choice factors, that we can explain away 100% of the wage gap. And I certainly don't mean to suggest that sexism doesn't exist or discrimination doesn't exist. There are unfortunately many cases where that is still taking place in our economy, and so that may be part of what is unexplained in the blue portion of the pie graph that you see here.
Hadley,
factors? Yes.
can I stop you just a second?
Sure.
I think I've got a video recording working here, so
Okay.
I need you to just clap your hands once so I can get an audio sync.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Wonderful. So there remains about 3.3 cents on the dollar, at least according to June O'Neill's work, that is unexplained by some of these factors that I've been talking about. And it could be discrimination. It could also be factors like the lower likelihood that women will make a counter offer on their first salary, or that they will ask for raises. Some of these things just have to do with the different ways that men and women approach their work and approach their wages. Now, for people who have experienced discrimination,
We have a
yes.
question from the floor.
Yeah,
Oh, sure.
just back on the pie graph, you were saying 3.3 cents on the dollar, and
Right.
those numbers don't add up to a dollar.
Oh, right. So when you add these up, you've got 9 plus 5 plus 3 plus 2 is about 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So this is the wage gap. So what I mean is, when there's about 20 cents here, that's because in the year 2000, the wage gap was 20 cents. Women were earning 20 cents less than men. So as you add these numbers back in, you would say, for example, the unexplained wage gap would result in women earning 97 cents on the dollar compared to men. Does that make sense?
We have another. Do you want to take questions now, or do you want to take questions later?
We can take them as we go. That's fine.
Okay. Can you see? Just have a seat.
I don't have to come to the.
Can you hear?
You can see that you're there.
No, that's not working right now. Okay, so.
I can hear okay.
All right. Actually, did you get your question answered? Because
Well,
I didn't mean to interrupt you. And then I'll follow you.
Actually, the answer once again disagreed, because you said 20 cents of a gap the gap was 20 cents, and 3.3 cents of that was possibly because of discrimination and so if it was $1, then 20 cents times 5 would be $1, and that would be 15 cents on the dollar instead of the 3.3 cents on the dollar.
I'm not sure I'm following your.
Well, the gap is 20 cents.
Okay.
So if you add those up, they
So,
get
because it's 3.3 cents out of 20 cents. So when you want to convert that to 3.x cents out of $1, it's going to be 5 times that much. It'll be 16 for every
these
dollar
are
of difference.
percentages.
It would be 16%.
The 3.3 is not a percentage of the pie graph.
Right, but
It's the number.
when you say okay, so but how many? What? So you've got like a $20 salary or a $5 salary per hour, or whatever it is. So there would be 3.3 cents per hour of that times the number of hours. It's not going to ever make it to 97. Your numbers.
I don't understand what you're saying.
Can I jump in here, Hadley?
Sure.
Okay. What I believe is happening is if you add all that up, you get roughly about 20 cents, 17 cents, or whatever. So there's 80 cents, which is not shown on the pie graph. Does that make sense?
Okay.
That's right.
All right.
Okay.
So that's where the 3.3 cents comes from on the dollar. Okay. Thanks. Now it's at you.
And your name?
Jane.
Jane. And by the way, hi.
Hi, Jane.
Hello.
Can you hear Jane?
Yes, I
Can you
can.
hear me? Okay. I'm sorry, I don't mean to have remedial help, but could you explain again what you mean by the experience, just for my own
Right.
edification?
So experience means it can mean a variety of factors. In June O'Neill's work, I think she focused on the types of positions that are held, so how advanced a woman's position was. And she separated time out of the workforce as a separate piece of experience. And so that's not included here. But she means, how many years someone has spent on the job or at what level they were working when they gained that workplace experience.
Okay, it's just
So for example, someone may be working in a job where they are in senior staff position, or someone may be working as a junior staff person, and that's sort of where she comes up with the experience variable.
We have another question, Scott.
Okay.
One factor that I've been told is a major one is benefits, and I don't see it in this analysis. Are benefits included in this?
So I don't know where June O'Neill might have included benefits in her, in this particular study from the year 2000. It may be that would go in the unexplained portion here, but that was one of the ones that I put on the list in the previous slide, that yes, other benefits would make a big impact. And certainly as we've seen the cost of health insurance increasing, if more women choose jobs that have health insurance, then that's going to put a dent in their cash wages.
Well, it's also, it depends on the benefits, but if it's, say, time off for work or something, women are more likely to use that than men are. So that's, in effect,
Vacation days,
a
sick
higher
time, or
wage.
personal leave. Right. No, I agree, and it could, and that so in that case, I would assign that either to the timeout variable or the unexplained variables here. Different economists are going to categorize things differently and try to quantify them differently. But this is just one example from the year 2000 when an economist did try to break down how some of those different variables account for portions of the wage gap.
Okay, continue, please.
Okay. So I did mention that unfortunately discrimination persists, but we do have, as women and men, we have legal protections against sex-based discrimination on the job. The Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963. It says a lot of things, but the key portion says no employer shall discriminate between employees on the basis of sex by paying wages to employees at a rate less than the rate at which he pays wages to employees of the opposite sex. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 very similarly outlawed sex-based wage discrimination, and Title VII of this act created the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission that exists to this day and continues to litigate cases against discriminatory employers. So women who have faced discrimination can file a complaint with this EEOC. And I mention all that because Ralph asked me to speak about some alternative approaches to the wage gap. And there were people, even in the 1960s, who opposed some of this legislation. And one of those people was Milton Friedman. He didn't believe that we should legislate equal pay for equal work. And I'm not sure if this is going to work, but I'd like to play this video if I can. This is Milton Friedman discussing the concept of equal pay for equal work. Can you all hear this?
Yes.
Okay.
No, we can't.
No.
We can hear her. We can't hear the video.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah, you're running into the same kind of problems I run into.
Okay, so you can't hear the music playing in the video?
No.
Okay, well, I thought that that might be the case, and so I included some of what he said here. A young woman asked him, you know, do you not believe that women deserve to be paid equally with men? And Milton Friedman said, I don't think deserve has anything to do with it. And what he means by this, and I'm going to get real libertarian here, but prices are meant to signal information in the economy, right? And wages are a form of pricing. So essentially he was saying that there are subjective values that people place on different types of labor. So some employers are going to be willing to pay you higher or lower wages depending on what the work is and how they value it. So deserve doesn't really have anything to do with it, but rather in a market economy it has to do with the equilibrium between the labor you're supplying and the labor that someone else is demanding. Secondly, he said, you want to make it costly to employers to exercise their prejudice. So essentially he was saying if we legislate equal pay for equal work, then employers will have to pay women and men the same price, and if they are truly sexist, then they will hire all men. But if, absent that kind of legislation, they chose to employ men over women, they would be paying a price for discriminating. And he told the young woman, he said, I'm on your side, but you're not. And that's how I feel often when I'm talking about the wage gap, and other feminists on the left say we need to do more to legislate against this kind of discrimination. It's important to understand the premise. Whenever we try to solve a problem using legislation, we want to define what the problem is. And it makes sense that if women are only paid 83 cents on the dollar for the same work, then employers in our economy, I suspect, could save 17% on their labor costs by hiring only women, and I imagine a lot of them would do so because although sexism is a very ugly thing, few employers are going to allow their sexism to get in the way of their bottom line and their profit margin, at least not to this extent. So the proposed new legislation that has been introduced in the U.S. Senate is the Paycheck Fairness Act. And this bill has not become law, and I'll explain a little bit about what it would do. So it's intended to put more teeth on the existing legal protections that women have against discrimination in the workforce. So women would have to opt out of class action lawsuits rather than opting in if the Paycheck Fairness Act were law. Today you can opt into a class action lawsuit against a discriminatory employer, but under the PFA, women would automatically be included in such lawsuits. The Paycheck Fairness Act would also invert our justice system, and I find this very troubling because we do have a justice system of innocence until proven guilty. But instead, under a PFA system, employers would have to prove their innocence, essentially, by justifying different wage differences based on business necessity. And business necessity is something, some phrasing that is in the legislation, but it is not defined. And you can imagine that trial lawyers would have a lot of work on their hands defining exactly what a business necessity is. And when we have unclear language in legislation, especially when it leads to more legal exposure for employers, the response from employers often is to protect themselves. And one protection employers might use is to put into place more rigid compensation schedules or guidelines, essentially treating employees more like widgets and less like individuals who can negotiate for their own pay. And for women like me, the bad news is this could result in fewer flexible work options. So between me and a male colleague, if I asked to work from home and my employer said, yes, I can do that, but it's going to impose a cost on us as a business to allow you to work from home, so I'd like to pay you less, it's really going to become unclear in a court of law whether that was a business necessity or whether there was another way that the employer could have avoided paying me and my male colleague two different salaries. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm afraid could lead to sort of a backfiring effect on the opportunities that women have. It could ultimately lead to less hiring and promoting of women in the workforce because legal exposure for employers is a part of their cost. You know, many employers carry some kind of liability insurance, but if the if the opportunities to sue employers, even employers who are not being intentionally discriminatory towards women, increases, then one response from employers, unfortunately, might be to simply avoid hiring women into their office places. And here's an interesting Department of Labor wage disparity report that came out in 2009, and I just wanted to highlight this particular quote from the study because I think it makes a good case against the Paycheck Fairness Act. It says, this study leads to the unambiguous conclusion that the differences in compensation of men and women are the result of a multitude of factors, and that the raw wage gap should not be used as a basis to justify corrective action. Indeed, there may be nothing to correct. The differences in raw wages may be almost entirely the result of individual choices being made by both male and female workers. And so all of this is to say the intent of people who support the Paycheck Fairness Act may be good, but there's a serious disagreement about what the wage gap is and whether or not we should pass more legislation to try to close it or correct it. And the Department of Labor here in its own study is essentially saying there may be nothing to correct, and certainly the raw wage gap is not evidence, shouldn't be used to justify corrective action. This emphasis or the bolding of the words here is mine. Now, a much more interesting conversation, I believe, is not what the wage gap is, but why it exists. And the bottom line is that men and women exhibit different preferences. So when you look at wage differentials between women and men who are very young or who do not have children and are not married, then the wage gap essentially disappears. In fact, one study found a reverse wage gap where young women without children living in major urban places were out earning their male counterparts by 8 cents on the dollar. So in that case, the wage gap, instead of being 83 cents on the dollar, would have been $1.08 compared to a man's dollar. Now, when women and men become parents, they start to exhibit more and more differing preferences. And this is from Pew Research Center. This is just a survey of men and women who have children, and they've asked, what is your ideal work scenario? And 79% of working fathers say they prefer to work full-time, while only 21% of working mothers, 21% of working fathers say they prefer part-time work. Now, the opposite is true of women. The majority of working mothers, 62%, say that part-time work would be their ideal work scenario, and 37% of working mothers say they would prefer to work in a full-time job. There are various reasons why men and women don't actualize their preferences. Obviously, some women and men feel that they need to work more hours than they would otherwise simply because they have a financial need, and that's something to keep in mind. While on the other hand, there are women and men who may be looking for work and unable to find it, and so they're involuntary part-time workers. That's the way we call it in the Bureau of Labor Statistics world. But it is interesting to me to see that when you ask women and men what their preference would be, that we do see a very different preference between moms and dads. Now, sometimes we talk about whether or not the wage gap should be closed, and should be $1 for $1. And the thing is, the wage gap is a measure of outcomes. It's not a measure of opportunity. And wherever possible, I think we should try to measure opportunities and try to ensure that opportunities between men and women or among people of different racial and socioeconomic backgrounds are equal. But outcomes are always going to be different when there is individual choice. And the fact is, women and men are making different choices. Like I said, a much more interesting discussion is why they're making different choices. Some people might say, well, women and men are socialized into these expectations. Women face the expectation of staying with children, while men face the expectation of, becoming breadwinners and maximizing their earnings and so forth. But no matter what the reasons why, we do see that there are choices involved, and that is driving different outcomes. So my position is that the goal should not be to close the wage gap, but to provide maximum opportunity for men and women to pursue happiness as they define it. But on the other hand, I believe we can do a better job preparing young people to make smart choices about their education, their career goals, and their finances, talking with high school students and college students about the different earnings that they can expect in different professions, and the types of workplace flexibility that will or will not be available to them in different professions, the different qualifications and degrees that will be required of them in different professions, and what sacrifices that might entail when it comes to other things they want out of life, whether that's having a family or living in a certain part of the country or being able to care for their aging parents or so forth. So I think more robust discussion about this in our high schools and in our homes and on our college campuses would ultimately lead to more flourishing and less of a feeling of victimhood among women who may feel that they never stop to think about the trade-offs that they would be making and how those choices affect their earnings. Now, I wanted to share a short video to sort of summarize everything that I've said, but I don't think it's going to work, so instead I'm going to encourage you all to visit our website where you can see this short video, and it's called Straight Talk About the Wage Gap. It's a 3-minute video that the Independent Women's Forum put together. It explains everything that I've explained here today, what the wage gap is, what it is not, why it exists, what to do if you are discriminated against in the workplace, what legal protections you have, and then it also provides sort of some of the same suggestions that I've made about talking with our sons and our daughters and our students and other young people in our lives about what professions are in front of them and how the choices they make will impact not just their earnings, but their overall level of happiness and the balance that many people today are trying to find between work and family life. And so I guess with that, I'll close, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to have a discussion about this. I think it's a very important topic. The people who support the Paycheck Fairness Act and other means to close the wage gap through government intervention, I believe, have good intentions, but I think, unfortunately, as is often the case, the result would be to hurt the people that are intended to be helped.
Scott has a question, and then I have some comments and questions.
Okay.
I'm wondering how the socialist do-gooders who believe that men and women are completely equal in all aspects explain the services or companies like professional sports where all the employees are male.
Right. So actually the two pieces of pushback that I often get are, well, maybe three. So first of all, sometimes people say, well, even if you look within the same profession, you see wage gaps. And that's true. My husband is a resident physician, so he's a doctor in training. And I can tell you that female doctors make less than male doctors. But again, that comes down to some of the other factors we talked about. There are more women who want to be pediatricians and family medicine doctors. There are more men who are going to become surgeons. And the differentials in pay are sort of explained there. The number of hours worked as well is a big difference in those different sub-professions. Now, the two big industries where this becomes very problematic and in some ways more difficult to talk about because it's harder to be politically correct, like you're saying, is the world of arts and especially acting. So in Hollywood, we see a big difference between what male actors and female actors are paid, and in sports. So we see a big difference between what male athletes and female athletes are earning. And my response to that is, I think what you're implying is men and women have, physically, we're very different. I think we're different in more ways than the physical. I think psychologically we're different as well. We have different strengths and different weaknesses. I would say men and women are not the same, and that is inherent in our nature. That is not entirely explained by the ways that we're socialized, although I would not write off socialization as a part of it. Now, I don't care if my accountant is a man or a woman, and so we see a much smaller wage gap between accountants than we do athletes. There is, however, a much higher demand for men in sports. There are more people who tune in to watch men play sports, so the ratings on television are higher. More people buy tickets and more people buy merchandise for sports where men are playing versus where women are playing. So this is driven by market demand. And I think it's very easy to demonstrate and document how market demand for male sports is much higher than for female sports. And so some people respond to that by saying, well, that's just because we're a sexist society. And as a sexist society, we prefer to watch men, dunk the basketball than watching the WNBA. But I would say that's a pretty broad accusation against our entire culture, and it's not really sexism, and it's something that each of us plays a role in. You know, I know at my house we certainly watch more football, where the NFL is, you know, full of male athletes. I don't think it comes down to sexism, but I think it comes down to the differences between men and women. I don't think that men and women are unequal under the law, and I don't think we have any laws that treat them that way. But I do think we can recognize that men and women are different, and that's demonstrated in the different choices they make in the broader economy, but it's also demonstrated in their differences physically in certain roles like sports and like the arts, where, you know, you don't see Jennifer Lawrence auditioning for the same roles that Bradley Cooper is auditioning for, because they're not interchangeable. And if they were interchangeable, then we would see a smaller wage gap. But because they're not interchangeable, they're not doing the same job.
Anybody else? Okay, so let me.
How are women's beach volleyball players paid? I was thinking of a nice sexist women prefer
Yeah,
sport.
well, I can tell you that female figure skaters are paid more than male figure skaters. And so there's not an absence of examples where women earn more in the world of sports, but it's very specific. You know, figure skaters put on these glittery outfits, and they twirl around, and they do, you know, something that people might consider to be more feminine or more beautiful. And so people like to watch women do it. And that's just, you know, I don't mean to explain why we like watching what we like watching, but that's the reason why they're paid differently.
Anybody else? Are we okay? We're gonna swing. Not Jane.
Diana.
Diane. I'm sorry.
Well, I have a couple of questions, but the first one, I was listening to a Federalist Society panel with Gail Harriet, and they were talking about Title VII
Okay.
and disparate impact as opposed in terms of discrimination in hiring and so forth, and that there were a lot of changes to, it is Title VII, that that made it much easier to sue an employer for discrimination and so forth. I mean, I guess I'm a little bit concerned because we're starting to see more and more attention, especially in public sector hiring, in terms of, you know, how many women are being hired and so forth. I mean, what do you see in terms of general trends, disparate impact in terms of ratios of women in the workforce?
Wow, that's a great question. So there have been a lot of changes, not just to Title VII and the Civil Rights Act, but also to Title IX, the education law, under the Obama administration. And a lot of this, I think, is driven by the fact that there are folks within the Obama administration who are not happy with the lack of action from Congress on the Paycheck Fairness Act and on other gender equality fronts. And so, yes, in the public sector, so the Obama administration has, any administration has a lot of control over how public sector employees are paid in the federal government, and also when it comes to federal contractors. And so we've seen things like requiring that all federal contractors, for example, provide a certain number of personal leave days. And this is sort of, I think, one way that the administration has tried to get around the fact that they cannot force all employers in the economy to provide paid family leave, which is a goal of theirs. So they can do this through executive action, but only as it impacts public sector hiring and federal contracted employers. So yes, I think it is problematic, and I think any kind of affirmative action in the way that women are hired into certain positions and promoted within the organization or within the government, it's similar to what I was saying about the Paycheck Fairness Act. Those types of quotas can undermine women's success, because we start to question whether or not that woman is in that position because of merit or because of a quota. And there's an international treaty called CEDAW. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of this, and I don't know exactly what CEDAW stands for. I used to know, but I can't quote it off the top of my head. But it has to do with an agreement against discrimination against women. And all the countries in the world have signed it. Almost every country in the world has signed it. I think there's a few countries in the world that have not signed it, and the United States is one. And CEDAW would require that our parliamentary body, or Congress, has the same proportion of female members as is reflected in the general population. And the United States doesn't want to sign this because we don't believe that seats should be assigned in Congress according to your gender. But we get a lot, I feel like there's all these maps of the world where the United States is the only country that doesn't have paid leave, and we're the only country that hasn't signed CEDAW, and we're the only, and it seems like we're treating women so badly compared to the rest of the world. But, I think Afghanistan has signed this treaty, and I wonder if women are really better off in Afghanistan because they've signed this particular treaty requiring equal numbers of women to be in their parliament. There's a lot of cultural factors and legal factors outside of these quotas, I think, that demonstrate that the United States is far ahead in our treatment of women compared to most of the countries in the world. And when we allow women maximum freedom to negotiate our own compensation, that means that we also have the freedom to, as I said earlier, trade that higher cash salary for some of the benefits that women want, like working from home or having a flexible job arrangement that allows us to maximize our happiness, although we may not be maximizing our earnings. So sorry to go off on a tangent, but I'm glad that you brought that up because I do think there's always efforts from the executive branch to sort of act on issues that have stalled out in the legislative branch, for better or worse, and I think a lot of these initiatives from the Obama administration have been for the worse.
Anybody else? Kate?
Can I add
Oh,
just
I'm
one
sorry.
more little question? Well, one point, either in the unexplained part, or just understanding that there does exist some legitimate pay gap, and the fact that we obviously would like to see a cultural response because then it would be much more dynamic. And I have heard pieces of information that there are organizations that are working to help women develop their negotiating skills, whether it's at community colleges or whatever. I mean, are you seeing more of that so that we can say, look, there is an alternative?
Right, and there's a lot of different approaches on this. Some of them I like more than others. There are some organizations that are lobbying, for example, for employers to make all of their salary information public. I work for a 501c3, so all of our salary information is public because we are a nonprofit charity. And there are some organizations that already do this. Now, depending on how you feel, that may be a violation of workers' privacy. There may be some workers who prefer not to have their salary information made public. But that's one avenue that some people say, if only women had more information about what they're paid. But there are websites where you can go online today and you can say how many years experience you have and what field you work in. And you don't say if you're a man or a woman. You just say all these other things, and it tells you sort of based on the part of the country that you live in and other factors, what is the average pay for someone in your position. And I think information in general can be very good. It equips women, it equips men to say to their employers, this is what I'm worth. But that's a very, individualized conversation that each of us has to have with our employers about whether or not we feel we're being paid fairly. And what I think is fair pay for my position with my experience and everything that defines me as an individual.
I think the answer to that is not enough.
It isn't right.
Well, I remember reading a story about one woman who had a very high-profile case against a previous employer and lost, and then she went on to direct a company, and she decided to pass a rule that said that when people were offered compensation packages, there would be no discussion. So she wanted to even the playing field so that if women had weaker negotiation skills, then and it was surprising how many people just, of course, you vote with your feet, so a lot of people left because they said, well, after all, it is kind of nice to have the power to negotiate. Women just have to get better at it.
Yeah, well, and I have heard that women, although they do less negotiating on their own behalf, actually make better negotiators than men if they are negotiating on behalf of someone else. And so that's like an interesting factoid. I think that you're right that there's going to be different approaches, and some people don't like to haggle for a car. Some people don't like to go to an automobile dealer and say, what am I going to end up paying? And so there have been things like TrueCar.com. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but basically where you agree upon the price of the car before you even walk in. And so different people are going to be served better by different approaches, and I think an abundance of different options and approaches is going to be better than limiting the styles by which employers can offer different compensation packages. So I hope
Scott.
that answers that question.
Okay, I'm sorry. Are you finished, Diane? Scott.
Since you mentioned that your husband is a resident,
Right.
I'm a little older, I'm sure, but I just wanted to point out that when I entered medical school in '73, my school was relatively unusual for having about 50% women in the class of medical students. But very quickly I saw, and residency is a good example, individual choices in what specialties you go into. So that told me very early on that individual choice is the key, not what the numbers are in any particular specialty or whatever. Oh, and I am a surgeon, incidentally.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, and you know, the whole wage gap discussion, I'll say this and then maybe I can wrap up on this note. The idea that each of us is valued only based on a number, based on the money that we earn, I think is a bad premise. You know, women contribute an enormous amount to our country, to our economy, to our homes, to our communities, that is not going to be reflected in the wage gap, because the wage gap only measures money, and it only measures the money that you're getting paid. It doesn't always measure all these other things that have value, but aren't being measured by wages. And I think to measure, you know, someone's success simply on this number, how much money they earn, is a very masculine way of thinking about things. And so in a way, I think there's a little inherent sexism in the whole conversation, that men and women should be earning the same amount because we should all be trying to maximize our earnings. Because that's something that men choose to do more often than women, but that doesn't mean that it's always the right choice, doesn't mean that it's the best choice, it doesn't mean that it's the choice that brings the most flourishing to our homes and communities, but it is an important part of the discussion, and one that I hope that there will be more understanding about. I have a friend who recently spoke at Harvard University to a group of young women who are students there, and you can imagine if they're students in the undergraduate program at Harvard, then they are among the creme de la creme of our students in this country. And she asked them, how many of you believe that when you leave Harvard and you go to work in the same professions as your male cohort, you will be paid, you know, 20, 25 cents less simply because you're a woman? And she said most of them raised their hands. And so most of the women in this classroom at Harvard believe that the wage gap is a measure of unequal pay for equal work. And part of our job at the Independent Women's Forum, part of what we hope to do, is to reassure women and to empower women with the knowledge that they will not necessarily meet that level of sexism when they enter the American workforce, that they should be encouraged that this is their individual choice, and that they do have things that they do will make a difference in how much they earn and how happy they are with the trade-offs that they're making. And so this isn't just about public policy, but this is really about having a culture that's healthy, where men and women don't see the economy as a war of the roses, where we're splitting the pie, but that we're actually celebrating the success of men and women, whether that's higher wages or other contributions, because it's a very dangerous thing to start splitting the pie. You know, we want to grow the pie, and when my husband gets a big raise when he finishes residency, we're going to have a wage gap in this household. He's going to be out earning me by quite a lot, and I'm not going to cry about it because we're sharing those resources. You know, and that's the way most households in the country work. Men and women are both contributing to the household income, and I don't see, you know, especially with my husband, I don't see this as an antagonistic thing, but something where I want him to do well and earn as much as he would like to earn, and the same goes for me. So I'll finish with that.
Before you finish, do you need to run?
I need to go in about 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, Kate.
On a wrap-up question here.
Okay.
If you're talking with people who make this statement that women earn X percent of every dollar that a man earns, and that's just a flat-out statement that they make, what is a one-sentence reply that you could give that would help to frame the conversation differently?
Well, I would say that the wage gap statistic is true, because I think there's a disagreement about, you know, whether or not we should say it's false or it's a myth. and they'll say, well, look, this Department of Labor study says, it's true. Statistics can be true even if they're interpreted in the wrong context. I would say it's true that on the whole, women earn less than men, but that statistic doesn't compare apples to apples, oranges to oranges, doctors to doctors, teachers to teachers. And if we want to measure equal pay for equal work, we have to correct that statistic for other factors. So I'll stop there because you asked for one sentence. My tendency is to give more than one sentence, but I think it's important just to say it's not a comparison of equal pay for equal work.
Hadley, I want to say thank you so very much for this presentation. I think she deserves a great round of applause.
Thank you.
Just like administrative stuff, please give your website name and
Of
where
course.
people can contribute to International Women's Forum.
Independent.
Is it
Independent, yeah, it's Independent Women's Forum, yep.
Okay, I just lost 10% of my income.
Oh.
You can get on their email list too.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
give us the spiel, and then before
Okay.
you leave, I would like to get a copy of your slideshow, your
Okay.
Excel, not Excel file. Anyway, your slideshow, so that it can be posted with the this presentation, which was absolutely wonderful. I'm going to say let's give her a round of applause once she finishes doing the administrative stuff.
Okay, so the Independent Women's Forum, as I said before, our mission is to increase the number of women who value free markets and personal liberty, and our website is iwf.org. IWF stands for Independent Women's Forum, and we're also on Facebook and on Twitter. We do have an email list. You can sign up for it at our website, iwf.org. I'm on Twitter. My Twitter is @Hadley Heath. That's my maiden name, and I'm happy to hear from any of you. My email address is hadley@iwf.org. And I'll send a follow-up to Ralph with my slides, but as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, I hope that you'll all go to our website, if for nothing else, than to find the video called Straight Talk About the Wage Gap. It's 3 minutes long, and Kate asked for a one-sentence rebuttal of the wage gap. This is a 3-minute rebuttal, and very easy to share with family and friends or other people on social media. Because it's not a very combative video. It simply explains what the wage gap is, what it's not, what we can do about it, what we should do about it, maybe what we should not do about it. And so I hope you'll explore that resource. And Independent Women's Forum is a charity. We're a nonprofit group, so we do exist at the pleasure of our donors. And if you like any of the work that you see, then I encourage you to support us. And like I said, reach out to me anytime if you have any questions. And I'd like to, again, thank Ralph and Kate for inviting me, and all of you for having me today.
And I do hope you come back again for a different topic that intrigues you. Thank you so very much. You were wonderful and charming again.
Can I just
Thanks,
ask
Ralph.
one quick little thing? Well, you mentioned CDOT. What is the
Yeah.
acronym? Is CDAW?
CEDAW. So
Oh, okay.
I can look it up quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Hadley,
Right, so
thank you so much again.
it stands for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And it's a UN treaty. And the United States hasn't signed, and so I
Okay.
hope that we don't, because I think it's misguided.
And it was not signed because of pressure by Hooters.
I think it was not signed.
You're so well,
There's people who have been about this for many years. We also don't have an equal rights amendment in the United States. And Phyllis Schlafly, who's you may have heard that name before. She actually passed away just this year. But there were a lot of women who, like the Independent Women's Forum, would just prefer to have women and men's rights and opportunities be equal rather than the outcomes. So that's all for today.
Thank you
Thanks
so
again.
very much. Really, thank you. And we'll talk soon. Thank you,
Okay.
Hadley. Bye-bye.
Bye.